everyone, welcome to another video. In this video we'll discuss all about GST on rents, whether it is about renting or properties typically used for residential purposes or for commercial purposes. What would be the GST liable on the rents being paid by the tenants? So let's directly look into the concept. Now here you have a landlord and he's letting out a property which is primarily used for a residential purpose, and this property is being let out to a tenant. Now in this case, up to July 2022, there was absolutely no GST on these kind of transactions. It was immaterial whether the landlord or the tenant was registered under GST, so long as the property in question was a property which was primarily used for residential purposes. There was absolutely no GST on these kind of transactions. What if the property is a commercial property? That is, you have a landlord and he's letting out a commercial property to the tenant. Then obviously there'll be GST which will be applicable, and the primary responsibility of collecting or levying GST on the rents being paid by the tenants would be that of the landlord. That is, if the landlord has obtained a GST registration, then he would be the person liable to collect GST on the rents being paid by the tenant. Again, here it is immaterial whether the tenant has obtained a GST registration or not. So long as the property is a commercial property, the liability or the onus is on the landlord to collect GST. Now this was the situation up to July 2022, wherein there was no GST on properties being let out which is primarily used for residential purposes. But after July 2022, the scene slightly changed. With respect to commercial properties, the concept was the same, that is, GST would be liable to be collected or will be charged on the rents being collected by the landlord. But as far as residential properties are concerned, the scene slightly changed. Let's understand this through examples. Now if you have a landlord here and he's letting out a property which is a residential property, but typically for a commercial purpose, then you have to go forward and look at the status of the tenant. If the tenant has obtained a GST registration, then he would be the person liable to pay GST on reverse charge basis. That is, at the time when he makes the payment of rent to the landlord, at that point of time he has to calculate 18% GST and pay the same from his pocket to the government. Now suppose he is unregistered, then you have to go back and see the status of the landlord. If he has obtained a GST registration, then he would be the person liable to collect GST on this transaction from the tenant, because the tenant in this case is unregistered. So as long as the property is a residential property used for a commercial purpose and the tenant is a registered person, then he would be the person liable to pay GST on RCM or reverse charge mechanism basis. So this was the situation which changed after July 2022. Now the next obvious question is, what if this property is a residential property but also used for a residential or a dwelling purpose? Now in this case, if you have a landlord and he's letting out a property which is a residential property and primarily used for residential dwelling itself, and if this property is being let out to a tenant, then again you have to go forward and look at the status of the tenant. If the tenant has obtained a GST registration, then again he would be the person liable to pay GST on reverse charge basis. If he has not obtained a GST registration, in other words he is unregistered, then in this case there will be no GST, because the property in question is a residential property used for 100% residential purpose, and in this case of transaction between the landlord and the tenant, there will be absolutely no GST. In short, if I were to sum up, renting out of residential properties to tenants who are registered under GST would definitely attract GST, and this would have to be paid on reverse charge basis by the tenants themselves. So properties which are residential in nature but used for either residential purpose or for commercial purpose by tenants who are registered, they will have to pay GST by themselves on reverse charge basis. But what if the tenants are unregistered and the properties are residential properties? You go back and see the status of the landlord. If it is of commercial nature and the landlord is registered, he will be liable to collect GST. If they're using it for residential purposes only, then there's no GST in question. But I hope I was able to make things clear through this particular video. If you like the video, please do show support to us by hitting the like button. If you want more videos like these on a regular basis, you could also think of hitting on the subscribe button. Till then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care and thank you.